What's up, future shred lords? Welcome back. Death of the Fingers. We're just gonna do the pentatonic scale today, but with the whole new rig and stuff like that. I sort of been working on it in the background, trying to figure out how to make these lessons a little better. So we're gonna give it a go with the pentatonics. So without further ado, let's do this. All right, in this first section, obviously we have to start off with the major scale, so we're gonna look at that right now. Essentially, this is all the information you really need to know about the major scale and basically music in general, because you're going to use this slide rule, if you will, to basically be your anchor with respect to figuring out how to use and apply new musical techniques. It's incredibly useful and it's essential information. So spend time every single time you pick up the instrument trying to apply one of these basic principles to the instrument, and you'll find yourself learning so much faster. So the first one is obviously the number of notes in a scale, and we call those the scale degrees. So you'll see 1 through 7 here because that's basically diatonic scales, the major scale. And almost all scales are basically based off the idea of the major scale. And then, you know, once you go through modalization, you get all the other modes, and then you can start messing with the minor scale and whatnot. But it's derived from the major scale, so it's the most fundamental scale. And then underneath it, you see what we call the note names, and that's the key you're playing in this case, G major. And underneath that, we have a modal position associated with that note name and the scale degree called Ionian for the first degree, Dorian for the second, Phrygian for the third, Lydian and Mixolydian 4-5. Then it's Aeolian, Locrian 6-7, and then of course back to the start again with the Ionian mode. And finally, you have the step pattern, the distances between each one of those notes. So from G to A is a whole step or a tone. From A to B is another tone. From B to C is a half step or a semitone. And that's incredibly important to understand. And if we move to the next slide here, essentially what you're going to see is this represented on the fretboard with this one single sequence here, where you essentially see me ascending in those steps, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G, right? With the distances between them of whole and half steps or tones and semitones. And you can see me basically covering each position now. The first one being the Ionian mode, the third one being Phrygian. This last one, the 7th degree, being Locrian, F sharp. So the most important thing to remember here is that this slide rule, if you will, the only thing that really changes is going to be the note names. And then, of course, you're going to use the same principle for all other scales. So there'll be 7 notes in like the melodic minor scale, and it'll have a bunch of note names, and then it'll have a bunch of modes or chords built off its scale degree. Another one for modes you can interchange is chords. So keep that in mind. Obviously, the first degree is going to have a major chord. Well, we're talking about scales today, so that's another lesson with respect to chords. But of course, chords and scales are intimately integrated. And then, of course, you're just going to have a different step pattern. And realistically speaking, in the old days, that's what they used to do, is look at the distances between the notes and start messing with that step pattern, which gave new scales. And then they realized that as soon as you start playing the same scale off another degree, you get a different step pattern. But we'll talk about that now once we get to the pentatonic scale here. So that right there is ground zero. You got to learn what that little sort of Rosetta Stone of music actually means. And then, of course, you can start to use that to great effect, and it will completely unlock your musical abilities. Nothing more than those 4 basic sort of elements when it comes to scales. And that covers a huge body of music. So food for thought. Now let's move into looking how we can convert this major scale into the pentatonic scale. With the pentatonic scale here, essentially you're seeing that it's the exact same thing that we had before with the diatonic scale, except we've erased 2 degrees. We've gotten rid of the 4th degree, and we've gotten rid of the 7th degree. Now the distances between the 3rd degree and the 5th degree remain the same as if the 4th degree was still there or the 7th degree was still there. It's a minor third, meaning a tone and a semitone, or a half step and a whole step put together, right? 3 frets, if you will. So that right there is characteristic of this scale, if you will, this sound that you get when you basically play that sequence of notes. It has a distinct flavor. And so that's incredibly important. So you can see that you're essentially taking a major scale and eliminating 2 notes from the 7 to come up with a new 5-note sequence. And then from there, essentially you have rock and roll and blues and metal and everything else. So you can see what happens with music is you don't need a million notes to actually have access to. You just need to know how to use these ones very effectively, of course, as many guitar players have shown. So the next slide here, if you will, is essentially, again, this visual representation of me just playing the scale on 1 string. I've just removed the 4th and the 7th degree. So once you get there, essentially a lot of things make sense because you can start to use modalization, which is what we're going to talk about next. So let's get into it. All right, the principle of modalization is actually very basic. Imagine I have a sequence of notes, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. Okay, that's the pentatonic scale. And I want to modalize this scale. What I'm going to do is after I do the sequence 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, I'm going to take the first note, I'm going to move it from the beginning of the sequence and put it at the end of the sequence. And when I do that, what happens is I'm going to get 2, 3, 5, 6, 1. And then I'll do it again, moving the second note now to the end. Then it becomes 3, 5, 6, 1, 2. Okay, so I think we're getting a basic sort of principle here. Modalization is just me using the same 5 notes or 7 notes or whatever it is for any of the major scale systems, and essentially just using the exact same notes but to build a new scale from a new position. And then we call those positions things like Ionian and Dorian, and you might hear the more fancy ones like Phrygian dominant, right? And then you have another set of scales, of course, called the symmetrical ones and diminished scales that don't really obey the same rules, so they're kind of their own special thing. But for all the other ones, the major modes, the pentatonic scales, bebop scales to a certain degree, the melodic minor, harmonic minor, the certain Hungarian minors, all of that good stuff is all based around this simple idea of modalization, where I take the 1 note and I just move it to the end of the sequence and I play the scale moving up at the second position, which is why understanding the linearity of the scale on just 1 string, like I showed at the beginning here, that's why that's really important, because now you can see, okay, each one of those little spots now becomes the starting position for each one of these modes. So when I'm doing anything in the Ionian position, I'm essentially playing the major pentatonic. And when I move to the Phrygian position, I'm doing the Phrygian pentatonic. It's as easy as that. All right, let me do a little jam here, and I'll show you how to use them with some sequences and whatnot and some string skipping. So don't just think of it as just playing up and down. Try to really, add some extra musicality to it to make these practice sessions more interesting. All right, let's do it. I'm going to do a little splurb here on the 3 octaves principles and similar shapes approach. So essentially, of course, we've talked about 3 octaves when I basically start with a note on either the low E string or the A string, or a B string if you have a 7 string. You can then use this basic principle of moving up in fifths, essentially, but skipping over a string, okay, like a power chord, and you get octaves. And essentially, when you have that, you can play the same types of shapes over each other. So sometimes the shape revolves around a step pattern like whole steps or a minor third. And then you can start using this 3 octaves principle to actually string multiple scales together from different positions to play a much bigger scale that sounds a lot more interesting. And of course, it's a new way of seeing the scale, and it covers a big part of the fretboard. So very important, that basic principle of 3 octaves and similar shapes approach. So I'm going to do another little section here, of course, using just this 3 octaves and similar shapes approach, again, to a backing track, slowly, of course. And then I just want you to sort of see that. One time I played them through diatonically, and the next time I'm now basically cutting across multiple shapes at the same time. And in my mind, I'm trying to keep track of where I am on the fretboard. So let's do it. All right, another way to essentially re-envision the pentatonic is to throw in a little 3-in-1, if you will. So it's essentially basically you're going to play 3 notes on one string, and then 1 note as you transition between sort of like the E, A, and D string. The A would only have 1 note, so you can do this little sweep. So you can then play another 3 notes on the D string, and of course then the G would have 1 note and 3 notes on the B string, and then just ending with 1 note on the high E. So this makes it very easy to play these scales incredibly fast, ridiculously fast. It's great technical workout. There's a lot of insane stretches in there, so, you know, take it easy kind of situation. But as far as just coordinating the mind and the hands, if you will, to play this kind of stuff, there's no better exercises you can ask for, because it's basically doing everything: alternate picking, sweeping, forcing you to concentrate. So, you know, we're just going to do a very, very, again, simple approach here, nothing serious, and work on this as much as any of the other ones, because essentially you're going to be trying to work towards combining all 3 together at the same time. The idea of just playing them in their static positions with respect to the diatonic modes. Then, of course, using the octaves principle and similar approach, right? And then finally 3-in-1. So let's do this. There it is, the pentatonic scale. Essentially, you know, just have the mindset that you're going to be working on this scale for the rest of your life. So there's no big rush, and instead try to really sort of focus in on the musicality and whatnot. Filling in some of the blanks, if you will, is one of the big ones with respect to just using this scale effectively. Some of the notes from the 3 notes per string system can severely facilitate the transition of notes and make it sound less abrupt. And then, of course, if you're more sort of leaning to the blues stuff, really understanding these positions are going to be absolutely key to mastering every sort of major level blues lick that has ever been written. So then it's just a question of superimposition, right? Remember, this is like a portable system, so I can pick it up and move it to anywhere. And a lot of times, at least 1 or 2 other scales is going to be sympathetic to the one that you're working in. So if I'm doing G major, I could also play B minor, which is E major, right? And a couple other ones too, right? Using the melodic minor at Dorian is another sort of variation on that, or maybe the harmonic minor at the sharp 5, right? So that's how the music theory starts to come into play when you're using this, and then you can just reverse engineer, right? Or you can play the pentatonic scale associated with the notes with respect to just the harmonic or melodic minor, which can be a very, very killer effect too, which means you'll start getting odd note groupings too. But we'll look at that in a later lesson. So good luck, practice hard, just keep working at it. That's the most important part. And we'll see you in the next one.